Right. Looks like we're live.
Thank you. Perfect. So good afternoon. I'd like to call the Community and Technical Colleges Formula Advisory Committee meeting to order at this time. Those of you that are joining us perhaps online or watching this later on, I'm Dr. Brent Wallace, the Chancellor of North Central Texas College, and I'm serving as our committee chair. I would like to remind you and be advised that today's meeting is being broadcast publicly and recorded. So before we begin, each time someone speaks, it's hard for us to remember this because we get into the thralls of our work and forget to do this perhaps. Please make sure you state your name before you speak, mute your devices when you aren't speaking, and try to keep background noise to a minimum as much as we can. I'm going to ask Ms. Burks if she would to call our roll to make sure that we establish a quorum. So Marie, could you help us, please?
Yes. Mr. Texas Buckholz.
This is Tex. I'm here. The background noise you hear is the 60-mile-an-hour gusts of wind rocking my office.
Oh boy.
Mr. Richard Cervantes.
Present.
Ms. Terry Crawford.
Terry notified me she would not be able to attend today.
Thank you. Ms. Mary Elizondo. Mr. Raul Garcia.
Here.
Mr. Jonathan Hoekstra.
Present.
Mr. Patrick Lee indicated he'd be unlikely to attend. So, Dr. Cesar Maldonado.
Present.
Dr. Jesus Rodriguez. And Ms. Mary Wickland.
Present.
A quorum is present.
And then we also let, I think, Mr. Jim.
I'm sorry.
Is there. Yes.
I'm so sorry. Next page. Mr. Jim Yiannopoulos.
Present.
Great. So we have established a quorum. We appreciate you being here today. And as always, this is hard work and takes a lot of time. So I appreciate each member's input and helping us get this important work started and completed. So our next agenda item is the consideration and approval of the minutes from the first meeting held on September 22nd, 2021. A draft of those minutes was included, and also if you have any kind of comments or questions or corrections, if you'll kind of let us know right now, we can try to do those things. Otherwise, if no corrections or comments or questions, I would entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
This is Jim Yiannopoulos. I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Jim. Do I have a second?
This is Tex Buckholz. I make a second.
Thank you, Tex. Any further discussions or questions? All right, the way I've been doing this is all in favor say aye, and if you're opposed, please speak up and let us know if you have any of those that are opposed. Okay, thank you. Those are carried. Our next agenda is the discussion of our charges once again to the committee, and so we'll go through each of these and see where our work groups are. I want to just take a moment to thank our work group leaders, because that's a lot of work, and you've been diving into data, several of you. I've noticed that Marie's been providing some data to some of your subgroups to make sure that we align with what you've been wanting and that requesting. So thank you for your work. We'll start with charge one, which is the study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding levels for the contact hour core and student success funding. And that's one of the ones that normally takes a little while. Richard, you have been leading that group. Can you maybe give us a little update on your progress and if anything we can add and input and further information you might want to have?
Will do. Thank you, Dr. Wallace. So we met last week, seems like forever ago, October 18th, and we had a majority. We also had Mr. Garcia also joined us, as well as the two staff members, Burks and Cormier, and had a very spirited discussion. Went about an hour and a half. I think we made a lot of progress. But I do want to thank the coordinating board for, again, to echo what you had said, Dr. Wallace. We kept asking for updates and they kept providing them. So it was very much appreciated. So just as a reminder, our charge is to make recommendations for the appropriate funding levels for contact hours, core, and student success as well as the Bachelor of Applied Technology. So I'm going to go through those one by one and begin with the core funding discussion. So going back to our September 14th meeting, we had stated from the onset that we wanted to look very seriously at what had been provided at the last advisory committee. And they had made a request for an additional $32 million to add to the $68 million that we were getting core funding for all the colleges. We discussed back then three different items or justification for doing that. The increased cost associated with activities that were occurring, hitting almost all of our community colleges, safety and security on campus, the active shooter sort of information and cost associated with that, cyber security, specifically ransomware, and Title IX, the unfunded mandates that we have found as associated with that activity. Subsequent to having that discussion, the meeting last week, at that point, we were able to add some additional justification that also came from the previous Formula Advisory Committee. For the most part, we asked, are these still applicable? And for the most part, the answer was yes. There were some in there that we were unable to, and maybe there's some on the group that can add some clarification of what they meant. There were a couple of items in there that specifically increase high school initiatives to meet mandated requirements. We weren't real sure what that meant. We didn't have any answers. I've reached out to the previous committee and have touched base with them, but we haven't been able to get a response. So is there anybody on the call that can maybe explain increased high school initiatives to meet mandated requirements? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm muted. That was out of the original findings from our last Formula Advisory Committee.
Yes.
What you said? Okay. I recollect a conversation around the increased need for dual credit and the increased need for awareness of programs. And there was conversation about that. That may be what that's alluding to, but there's others that have been here before. Cesar, you may have some input on that too.
Yeah, it aligns with what you just said, Brent. You know, the level of college preparedness is at best flat and at worst declining. We're using dual credit, TSI camps, coding camps, and those types of initiatives to help the school districts increase that number. So thinking back to what we were talking about a few years ago, I think that's what it was.
That makes sense. And that would absolutely still be applicable today.
In fact, perhaps even more, Richard, today, because post-COVID, we're seeing our bridge programs are filling up. I mean, yeah, you're right.
That's a good point. The second one we weren't real sure about, may be the same sort of response, implementation of co-requisites.
So academically, at that point, we were sitting, if I remember correctly, and Emily and Marie may have to help me, we were sitting, weren't we, at the point of the new legislation that required the co-requisite model be totally universal. So rather than a developmental ed course leading to academic or transfer course, we were having to pair those together. Since then, our institutions have all moved to that. Now, there's still a lot of expense to that and associated with that, but I think the onus then was, how are we going to ramp up something that's pretty expensive to our local colleges in a co-requisite? That's my recollection. Again, Cesar, you would have been there. Mary would have been there. I think that's how we were thinking then.
You're right, and where we ended up is, we're 100% there.
Yeah.
And the cost is, it certainly isn't going down, right?
And there's some.
So I think once again, it sounds like that one is also still applicable. We haven't quite gotten out of the woods out of that one yet either.
And Richard, I've got some concerns, and others please chime in. I've got some concerns about what that may entail too, expense wise, because we're worried, as Cesar mentioned, about the less prepared post-COVID high school graduate over, and are we going to be successful with co-requisite, or are we going to have to begin to look at, are they even prepared for co-requisite if they're reading or writing or have math skills below even the 8th grade or 9th grade level? That's a concern I have, especially in our rural communities, that if that online was a challenge in the high school environment to go that way and prepare. I mean, there's a lot of concern there too.
Right. So, so it sounds like we're still believe that those items are still appropriate. We did add one more, and that one also came out of the pandemic to post-COVID, and it is the continued post-COVID cost associated with technology that was introduced during the pandemic. So we believe that the maintenance associated with what we put in is not going to be paid for by the federal government after we're done through this. And then the replacement cost of those also are, if we want to continue that sort of technology, we're going to have some additional costs that we didn't have prior to the pandemic. So I believe that one's appropriate too. Mr. Chair, if there's any other items that others would want to add to this list, now's a good time to add it. We just can go with what we have here.
Open for other thoughts for the work group. And Richard, that's really a conversation under core operational conversation, correct, at this point?
Correct. That's
right.
Correct.
So I think there is an underlying conversation, and I would look to those that are from different size institutions about the effect core has on a smaller institution, and medium size is far more imperative than is core perhaps to a larger larger community college. And in all fairness to the whole 50 in this case, I think that's something that we would look at when we finalize these things later on down the road, is to say, are we missing out on the appropriation side or recommendations for success points or appropriations for core, and if we can justify that. But we can do that later. I think that's probably something that's on some of our minds.
Yeah, that's and we didn't discuss it, but I've been thinking about it also, and was a little concerned about. I could see the other side of the coin too, that you could have the larger institutions saying, yeah, but our costs are going up much higher too for those same sort of items, and we're getting a fixed fee. So our fixed rate. So I could see, I don't know what the answer is, but it is an issue. I understand that. The last thing that I'd say in this was introduced at the last second, and I have not met with the committee on it, but Mr. Buckholtz said that we were just about to conclude our meeting, and he said that Representative Schaefer had introduced an amendment had passed during the special session, House Bill 160, that would also provide $100 million for all community colleges, and was adopted by the House. The amendment would provide $2 million for each college, and we didn't discuss it in any detail. And having discussed it with some of the folks over here at Bland, the response that I received back, don't know if it's accurate yet, is that would not be a permanent arrangement. That would be coming from federal monies, and it would not be sustainable. So I think our recommendation to add it up to the $100 million is sustainable and would be as we move forward. That's my understanding. If others feel differently, then please feel free to let us know.
That's totally correct. And then House Bill 160, when went to committee, et cetera, ended up zero.
Oh, it didn't even pass. Oh, okay. I thought it had passed the House.
No, sir. It did, but at conference and at committee, in the final version of that Senate bill, the community colleges only were given out of those federal monies, $15 million competitive grant for True.
Well, maybe we should add 200 million then. No, I'm just kidding.
But y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but Cesar, you've got a good handle on that too, but the final version was a total redo, and then the Senate, was it Senate Bill 8? Y'all don't quote me on that. I think that final came out special session. We did not receive that 100 million.
We did not, and we were at 15 on the true
Yes.
instead of what we'd originally asked for. It just from a philosophical standpoint, if you look at where we were asking for money, I think there's a stronger appetite for something that is performance-based versus a flat. I mean, that's some of the feedback I got from some of the legislators, but it moved pretty quick at the end. So I don't really know why it got put in the trash can.
I think that if we're honest, I think it's because of the infusion of federal dollars to the community colleges was at least the narrative. However, with all due transparency, the universities got far more of the same kinds of dollars than the community colleges did. So that's what it is. But we didn't receive that. And it's interesting that Schaefer had a bill that would garner $2 million per college over that period. I mean, that's interesting conversation to be had, that he thought that at that point was something reasonable in addition to true.
So I'm going to move on to the next item. Part of the model that we use to calculate how much we would recommend is tied to inflation. And we had a very spirited discussion about the inflation, and there was some concerns about the rising cost of inflation and the fact that the formula that we were using the consumer price index. And the formula that we were using goes back to previous years, and previous years which, quite frankly, did not have as much inflation as what we see coming down the pike. And so then that brought us to a discussion about, are we using the right tool? And we were told by the coordinating board that the general academic institutions had switched over to the HEPI, the Higher Education Price Index. And so we asked staff, and I believe they provided you that information, to go ahead and calculate the same using the same index to see and tie our formula back to these numbers. To be consistent with what other higher education groups are doing, but also as we looked at the Higher Education Price Index specific towards higher education versus much more global for the Consumer Price Index. And so the committee was recommending that we switch over to that. That change actually, I think, became very positive for us. So it moved the inflationary rate up to 6.8% and I'm speaking now specifically about contact hour funding, moving over to that discussion. So that 6.8% that we had applied to the contact hour rate moved that from 567 to 606. Then that would have, as we applied the funding formula recommendation, that would increase appropriation by 47.8 million. And because the contact hours had gone down and had been going down, that would still give us a 3.3% increase overall in that particular area. So that would raise us up for a total of 383.5 million. The lion's share of the formula would still come from this area, but a very large amount, as opposed to we were concerned that we might even be breaking even if we had used the old formula. That shows you the differences. A 3.3% increase.
Dr. Maldonado, you have a question, sir?
Oh, yeah. Yes, Richard, is that 6.06? I'm sorry, the 6.8% increase entirely from the inflation factor?
It's an average inflation. Is that correct, Marie? Still using the same formula, Marie, for a number of years, but using that particular index, the
Okay.
Higher Education Price Index.
Thank you.
You bet. Anything else? So now I will move to the success point funding discussion. And again, after applying that 6.8%, that gave us a rate the rate would increase from $247.91 for every success point funding to $264.78. And the updated projections, now we didn't just change the rates. We also once again went back to what the previous committee had recommended. Legislature did not approve it, but they had recommended some increases to success points for specific areas. And we went back to that and said, we are again recommending the addition of a 0.5 point each for academically and economically disadvantaged for transfer, critical field awards, and non-critical field awards. In addition, we did include an addition of a 0.5 point for the dual credit, 15 semester credit hour dual credit attainment. After you had reached that, you would get a 0.5 point. And then the last one we changed to what had been taken away. It just didn't seem to make intuitive sense to reduce the non-critical awards are down to 1.2%. We wanted it to match something else that had been changed. So we were asking that be restored to 2 points. After we did that, and this is a largest percentage increase, that would increase appropriations by $90.6 million, or a 28.8% increase. And that's our draft recommendation at this point until, and we keep saying that, I keep using the word draft because I am cognizant that there may be other groups that want to change other things that will impact what we're recommending.
Very good. Questions, please, comment. Cesar, is your hand still up, or are you?
It shouldn't be up.
Okay. A lot of work here. This is really good, and I appreciate hearing your thoughts about whether you wanted to move this forward yet or not. And I do think it would behoove us to hear from the other work groups, because it's going to so inform this. And in past, this has sort of been the very last one that we kind of finalized and then approved. And so I think this is really good data and really good look. I'll be honest, I'm a little shocked at what generates by using that new index. I'll be honest, that's really a powerful statement. I mean, really.
It went to, so right now, let me add the last one, the Bachelor of Applied Technology.
Oh, yes.
So that also, the only comments there that I make a lot is that also using the 6.8%, the rate would increase from 38.78 to 41.42. That funding recommendation, and it seems small certainly compared to the rest of them. It is a high percentage to 23.8% increase, but it would be 800,000 that we would add to that particular area. And when you consider all the millions of dollars that we're adding to each of the other items of formula, that's pretty modest, but it is a large percentage increase.
And that is now institutionally somewhat specific. And I'm trying to think which institutions, and we can get that to everyone before, but what is our total institutions with the BAT now? Do we know?
I think there are 5 eligible, 4 in practice that are offering the legacy program.
I knew it was not large number. I think I have a question somewhat, well, it is an ignorant question because I don't have a baccalaureate of science in nursing, a BSN. What is, and maybe this is Marie or Emily, what is being done to fund baccalaureate nursing programs that some of our 2 years have? And is that likened to the BAT, or are those just handled very much separately? I'm just curious about that.
So my understanding is in statute, any additional bachelor's programs beyond those 5 institutions that have that legacy circumstance,
their own.
Any institutions other than those are reimbursed at the community college contact hour rate.
Okay. And that was in the legislation at perpetuity, I suppose, for ever those BATs will receive that. I mean, it would require a legislative shift. Right. It require a legislative shift to change that.
Yes.
Sense. Okay, thank you. I intended to ask that earlier, and I don't mind asking questions. Perfect. Any other questions for Richard and his group? That was that's really good work and great.
Dr. Wallace, just
Yes.
one more comment for Mr. Maldonado made this comment about what the legislature may be looking for. So it was one of the items that we keyed in on, and that's the relationship between the funding relationship between contact hours and success points. And the last legislation had moved from either 10 or 11% success points total funding just between those two items to from 10% to around 18%. And now with the recommendations that we're making, it will take it even higher, but not substantially, but it would go from 18% to 21% of that total. And so the other parts, contact hours, would drop from 82% to 79%. So there is some shifting, and the committee did look at or did discuss some of the other relationships around the country of other organizations or other schools in other states and how they look, and they're all over the map. I've seen as much as 50% towards success points. So we're not too much different. I think we're different than everybody else, but there's a lot out there.
And I totally go ahead, Cesar. Go ahead.
I was going to say we're still early in the game, but part of our challenge, it's a zero-sum game. We move the same money around, so there really isn't a net gain for us. And the funding and I understand the politics of it for the bat and the bass. Why is it different? We've got businesses coming to us and saying, you've got to offer these because the universities aren't going to do this, and this is what we want. So it's a serious workforce issue. And I've discussed with some of the coordinating board staff the possibility of having some success points for low socioeconomic students, particularly coming off of COVID. These students are really going to need some extra help. So maybe that would be a one-time thing that could be revisited. But these challenges aren't unique to Houston. Each one of you have the same sort of challenge that you're facing with the students that are coming in.
And one of the things that success points are, as Cesar said earlier today, the success point rings true with legislation and rings true for even what we want to see happen as community colleges. But one of the challenges for some of us is a success point's great. We work toward those, but when you're very much an academic transfer institution who you don't always benefit from that like you do a straight appropriations formula. And then that's neither here nor there. We support those and we've done it to hold ourselves accountable in the future. But I guess I worry every time we get a little closer to a whole quarter of our 25%, I begin to get a little bit edgy and say, okay, that's great, but goodness, when you've got 50% of your students transfer to your universities in your back door every year, you begin to go, they may not barely earn that second. They may get the 15-hour, they may get the developmental, but you hardly ever get an opportunity to earn all your success points before they leave. That's a concern of mine at NCTC, so to speak. So,
Great.
All right. Yeah, Cesar.
If I could ask a question, maybe Marie could give us some guidance. I understand that Alpine University has moved into the associate degree space and workforce. Do you know how they're getting their contact hour reimbursement, at what rate they're reimbursed at? They're not coming out of the community college pot.
I'm not familiar with Alpine University, so
Okay.
but I can look to that.
Alpine is not public, is it? Is it public?
Yeah, it's
Are you talking about
Sol Ross.
Sol Ross.
Sol Ross. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sol Ross.
Yeah.
So Sol Ross is funded by the General Academic Institution formula. That is predominantly based on semester credit hours as of the 12th class day, so very similar to contact hour funding model that the community colleges have. I don't have an exact comparison because the semester credit hour rate would be different than the contact hour rate. We can conversion much what that would be.
But that is not, to Cesar's point, that's not coming out of this community college pot of money, so to speak, correct?
No, those semester credit hours would be funded through the general academic pot money.
Okay. Good questions. Any others? This is a thank you, Richard, and your group for all this information. Vice Chair Garcia, sir, do you have a question?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, question. So SALT University, I think is what I heard, is getting funded through the general fund, but so is community colleges. Other than, the general fund is carved out into different tranches, it's still coming out of general fund. It's almost like it's the same pot of dollars. It's just carved out differently. Is that correct? Is that my understanding? Is my understanding correct?
Yes, so the general academics are funded through a combination of what's called general revenue and general revenue dedicated funds. General revenue dedicated funds are certain tuition fees that the state collects and appropriates back to the institution. Community colleges don't have general revenue dedicated or tuition fees that are appropriated through the bill pattern or through the appropriations process. You are correct. It is all coming out of the same state general revenue pot of money, but the way the legislature looked at it is very two separate decision points. They make a decision on the funding for general academics, and they make a decision on the funding for the community colleges in two separate items.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. As always, if you have questions, please reach out through either myself, Vice Chair Garcia, Marie, to any of the work groups. You can email Richard directly if you have any things you think about after the fact, or any of our work group leaders. We're going to move on now, I think, to charge 2. Charge 2 is to study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding levels for the operations support and space support formulas for state colleges. And Mary, Ms. Wickland is here.
Yes, hello.
She's going to give us an update.
Yeah, so we aren't quite ready to make a recommendation. We had tossed around some ideas about the last 2 bienniums, the state colleges received additional funding to help reduce tuition and fees for students to make us comparable with the community colleges. And we're still, so we did do that. We reduced tuition and fees, and our enrollment has increased. And so we were kicking around, well, maybe if we could get a little more and get it more in line with the community colleges, maybe see where we're at. But we ended up dropping that. And, I feel like that, based on COVID hitting, and we don't have a true gauge as to the true enrollment impact of what the legislature did for us. So we want to be able to give a lot of evidence, before we have another ask in that regard. So, but what we were going to also do is look at using the higher education price index, and for our inflation and enrollment growth. But one of the things that has impacted the schedule, even though we're still positive because 2 of the state colleges do not have prisons, and our prisons shut down during COVID. Not due that we lost programs or anything, because now they're starting back up. But when our accounting period started, the prison closed. And so that loss in contact hour funding has affected, where we are in growth. And so I sent Marie this morning, I got some information from our institutional research person so we can share with the group. So we'll have another meeting, but we plan on wrapping things up at the next group meeting on it. So
okay.
that's where we stand.
Yeah, I would have never thought about the prison piece. That's huge for you folks and not
Well,
being
it's
able to
really
access
large.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge, large population for Lamar, Port Arthur.
Yeah, it is.
And yeah, so anyway.
Good. Questions for Mary? Any? So sounds like you feel like you may have a movable recommendation maybe by our next meeting, or at least get closer to that. That's perfect. So
Yes.
All right, perfect. We'll move on to charge 3. Any final questions before we do that? All right, charge 3, study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding level for and refinement of the TSTC system's return value funding formula. And Mr. Hoekstra, you'd like to give us an update on that, Jonathan?
Yes, sir. Sure will. So the Charge 3 work group met on October 20th. It was Dr. Crawford and myself, and then the coordinating board staff, Ms. Burks, Ms. Cormier, and Ms. Moore also participated. We're not quite ready to make a recommendation. We did make progress as we reviewed the return value funding formula estimates. We looked at the assumptions and calculations, and they were all straightforward, consistent with previous biennia, and just with an acknowledgement that it is the same cohort used in the estimate that was used in the just recent funding, and that gets updated when the actual base bill gets created down the road. But it's definitely consistent with what we've done historically. So it was favorably received. We looked at, had a little discussion about space support, something that's a bit unique to us and the Lamar's, where we use the same formula as the senior institutions. We did ask for some additional information associated with that, just take a deeper dive into the information that is generated to establish that funding. Had conversations about the predicted square footage, and sort of the basis for that, some of the things driving that. So we're just going to get additional insights into that. And so that information is forthcoming. We similarly talked about the inflation rate topic. They recommended or offered the same 6.8% that's being applied for the charge 1 analysis. And so that affects our TSDC space support, the dual credit funding, and possibly the small institution supplement, which I think is being considered by the senior institution members. And so I think co-board staff could speak to that. And so I think that was offered to us and the Lamar Institutes to consider. And then we did go over dual credit funding and the approach to that, discuss the appropriateness of the funding rates. And so I think there's some more determination over that, some conversation that we'd like to have with probably a more complete work group on that topic. And then lastly, we talked about continuing education. Reportable continuing education is not currently funded in the return value funding formula, and it's not separately funded. And so the coordinating board staff was going to generate some information about what funding would look like either under a contact hour formula estimate, or if it was treated under the return value funding formula. So we're going to take a look at that data, and with an acknowledgement, there's not much reportable continuing ed for TSDC, but as we sort of consider that an integral part of our mission, we wanted to kind of evaluate the impact and whether that would be appropriate going forward. So those were the high points. Still some work to do. I anticipate we'll have at least another meeting, but I feel like we're getting pretty close, especially with respect to the return value funding formula.
Perfect. Questions for Jonathan? I'm anxious to hear too from work group 5 here in a few minutes, because the CE question is not only on top of your minds, but also on the community colleges as well. So I'm anxious to see if there's some alignment in our conversation here in a moment. So any questions for Jonathan? Appreciate the work. Marvelous.
And
yes, sorry.
if I may, and apologies, somebody is enthusiastically leaf blowing outside my house, so apologies if it gets a little loud. But I did just want to take a moment to clarify again, we did adjust each of the charge 1, 2, and 3 models with the higher education price index for inflation. So I can send you guys a little more information on that, but it does look at a basket of goods that's really tailored to higher education. But I did also want to mention, we did also adjust the methodology for that. So the calculation before was really only capturing like 1 year of inflation. So we adjusted it to capture 2, and even looking backwards or at the last biennium, it did seem to perhaps underrepresent inflation. So it's a kind of 2 changes that in one with that happy adjustment. So.
And that, Jonathan, was that beneficial to the formula for TSTC like it is for the, I'm assuming it's beneficial.
It was for several of those formula. It's not factored into the return value funding formula. So that is exempt, or it was exempted from, from that adjustment.
Makes sense. Okay. Thank you, Marie, for reminding us. That's good. So charge 4 is to institute a formal process for the committee to recommend critical fields for inclusion and removal for success points based on the best available data trends and about regional and state workforce needs. Using that formula methodology and the most recently available data, develop recommendations for 2 sets to the coordinating board. 1 set of fields recommended for addition to the critical fields list, and 1 set recommended for removal. And Dr. Rodriguez has joined us. Roberto, thank you for being here, sir. And I'm going to give you time to give us kind of insights on where work group 4 is.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Where should I start? Well, a quick little background. The 2022-2023 CTE Formula Advisory Committee did address a similar charge last biennium, and they made some really good progress that I'm building on. I've met individually with some of the members, and I actually took another step, and during our last Texas Association of Community College meeting, I presented to the basic general assembly or the membership there, because the work that was done by the previous committee, I think, is pretty solid. The hiccups or heartburns that we're having is trying to identify the regional needs within it, and fully understand that the community college, we want to serve the needs of the state by developing and offering programs that supply completers within the target fields. The current methodology that's being used for identifying these targeted fields is not sufficient to meet the regional needs of our community colleges. That's where we struggle. The concepts of identifying the top 20 fastest growing and so forth, the concept is good. It's what data are we going to use? What exactly are we going, and how about are we going to identify these needs? So I did reach out to Ms. Burks, and actually the Texas Association of Community Colleges. We've got some great people working for us there to see what databases, what LMIs are they currently using that we can leverage to identify these needs. Because based on the quick research that we're doing, we do have the tools to determine the fastest growing and the largest demand occupations within the regions and at the state level. TWC provides data on current job postings and 10-year projections at the state and WDA levels. And you can find that data in their website, texaslaboranalysis.com, top statistics, something of that nature. And TWC provides state as well as WDA snapshots of what we can do. If you go and play around with them a little bit, you can see that the snapshots can be used because these databases do have filters. So what we're currently doing, and I'm kind of working with the folks that really know how to use these databases. If we use the high level data that TWCA, WDA uses and identifies that 10-year projection in the big jobs, we can use sub-filters in the regional approach by identifying sub-baccalaureate filters to identify the targeted fields that can inform the funding formula. So that's kind of where we're at. So, okay, we got this broad stroke at the state level. We're right now running comparisons by considering using this regional approach with sub-baccalaureate filters to see if we end up with the same result or something different. Now, we also need to figure out what is the appropriate regional definition for statutory or local needs. And we're discussed probably the idea of maybe using what the higher education regions that Ms. Burks provided, which already identified the regions. There's 10 of them. Maybe use how the current Texas Association of Community Colleges divides the current regions as we stand. And that gives each community college a platform where we can contribute at the regional level. If we define the target fields by educational level and by region, I think we can more fully consider how the funding formula incentivizes community college to serve the regional labor market needs. So right now we've got the big scope at the state level. We're playing with the databases to identify the regional levels to see if it gives us a similar result or not. And if it's not, then that region, whether it be region 8, I'm looking here at the higher education regions, or whatever region, each president, each community colleges can work collaboratively and say, hey, these are the areas of our region that we can address. Because right now at the state level, really, it's the metro areas that are dictating, the Houston, the Dallas, the San Antonios. But we're trying to see in the rural areas and more not as populated communities, what impact can we have at the formula funding here. So that's kind of the update. I'm gonna circle back with Ms. Burks. I'm gonna circle back with Texas Association of Community Colleges to run that that exercise to see what can we get as a region that might be different from the state. And then we need to develop how will we as a community college located in a certain region have a voice and a vote to contribute to that.
Raul, did you have a question, sir?
You read my mind, yes, sir. So as you can see, it really interests me, and please be patient with me. I'm still learning, and thank you for sharing that, Dr. Rodriguez. But one of the things that I recently learned this week is that there is a statewide group that puts together this work educational course manual, WECM, right? And I think they do a lot of work to try to, I guess, prioritize or increase the inventory coursework that is aligned with the workforce. And I think one of the challenges that I'm hearing is you're trying to regionalize the different community colleges within the same sphere of influence or academic programs. And maybe that body of work already exists at this level. Maybe this agency who puts this together can help you in trying to regionalize the workforce based on the needs that already exist there. Because I think they already get into that level of detail. I think, is my understanding, is that they get into that level of detail where they're working with businesses and understanding and doing their surveys and just, making recommendations. And they do a regular review of their inventory of that coursework. So I would be curious to see if maybe that could be another resource to help you navigate through this regional component. Just food for thought.
And Raul, what you have are two bodies of that work. You have the GIPWE, which is the actual guiding document for how we create workforce programs.
Okay.
Then WECM is your course inventory list for CTE. And they are, it's interesting, but you often could have a work group working toward WECM outcomes, create course content, but that is a large pot that may or may not fit the needs of the local region. And so it's sort of that the GIPWE is the aftermath of we've needed these courses to be added to business management, welding, HVAC, whatever that may be. And I agree with you, though, that those have to be in tandem. And at some point, and this would be a question for coordinating board staff. I thought I heard recently that we're getting close to a re-evaluation of GIPWE, perhaps, that's something that is coming up because it ages on us quickly before we know it. And I don't know if I heard that by my own hopes, or if it was, or if it was because the concern I have goes back to the notion of, even in the past, coordinating board and Texas Workforce Commission data has been pretty healthy, and it identified maybe correctly our targeted or critical fields, but then our student success points didn't follow those critical fields. So in other words, there was maybe the data's there, the alignment can be there, but then the success point alignment didn't occur for regional trends, didn't give credits to that. And so I'll be interested to know that as well, as you all look at the specific inventory of those, Dr. Rodriguez, and looks at what critical field doesn't make sense to the state anymore and what does for success points as well. I think that's going to be an important part.
Exactly. I mean, the 10-year projection is a 10-year projection of critical fields, right?
Yeah.
The state and so forth. The filtering process can also help to identify what stayed and what doesn't go at the state level. But furthermore, I think the regional approach, I'll give you an example here in Brownsville. It's grown. We've got SpaceX coming in. We got a lot of aerospace companies coming in. Well, that's not identified as a state need, but it's going to be a huge regional need for myself. So within the region of 8 or the South region, whatever you want to call it, I would like to have a voice and say, look, I'm building new programs to address the industry needs. So, and they're going to be hiring several hundred people. So that incentivizes me to invest and leverage our current resources in certain programs. So that's where we can say, as a region, it might not affect Amarillo or El Paso, but affects me. But it might be a different need in El Paso or Amarillo or Houston, for that matter, that they might have a different need. So as a region, you need to provide some sort of a voice and a vote to allow us as community colleges to identify critical fields or target fields that might help us out. Now, once that identifies, the second step is, how long do they last? And when do we take them off? So include them, keep them, and remove them.
Any further questions for this work group? Thank you so much for your work. I'm really excited about seeing where we can look at that and make that more regionally appropriate. And so I thank you, Dr. Rodriguez, for that. Our charge 5 is to study and make recommendations on inclusion of qualified non-credit workforce continuing ed courses, post-secondary industry certifications, and other workforce credentials in the student success point measures, implications to the existing formulas, methodologies, and as needed recommendations on any associated data and reporting course requirements or funding levels. Dr. Maldonado has been leading that group, and so we will lean to him now to give us an update on work group 5, sir.
Well, I'm embarrassed coming after Jesus with his database searches because I'm still trying to figure this flow chart out. It's good stuff. I just can't figure it out. And so we talked about the burdensome complexity at our meeting that we had on September the 27th. We had a very informative presentation by Marie and some other coordinating board staff to really get us started. And a couple of things, and I want to go off track here. I want to mention on the contact hour, in case I don't get back to this. You know, we are graduating and transferring students with fewer contact hours, but still a level of success. So we're down 3 hours per student. We graduated 7,100 and we transferred about 5,800. So that's $9 million for us. And so the reward for doing the right thing, which we're going to continue to do, but the reward is less funding. So somehow over in group 1, maybe we could figure out how to bring that up.
Well, and Cesar, that's a really valuable point, because a few years back, the state was looking at community colleges saying, why is the hours when you leave so high? And like many of us went from average of 96 hours per student to the 70s, and we've been financially punished for doing the right thing. I get that. Yeah, good point.
But it's on task group 5. We discussed obtaining success points for critical demand fields through CE. I mean, what's the distinction with CE, and why shouldn't CE be included? The end result of the economy, the workforce, is the same whether that goes through a CE course or not. We discussed the challenges with the shifting critical demand and an imbalance between critical demand locally, regionally, and statewide. We're not ready to make a recommendation yet. We're going to meet sometime in the middle of next month and come out with, hopefully come out with our first draft recommendation. And we're all of us are facing the same challenges with the misalignment of recognition of the value of CE and what the outlook on that is. There's going to be more and more of that as the economy shifts and incumbent workers start looking at gaining skills for mobility across different industries. So a lot of discussion, but we're not ready to come forward with anything yet.
And I understand that this is a big effort, folks. I mean, all of us have CE. It's meeting a very, very specific demand. It goes hand in hand with the notion of meeting your critical fields and targeted fields. It goes hand in hand with meeting industry demand and workforce. And there's a lot of conversation around the need for a quality workforce in Texas. Well, I would garner that some of that is CE capable. And so looking forward to hearing that. Cesar, I would have one question, and maybe it's a question that isn't answered today, but the group looks at, and that is, are we looking at any kind of, and you've alluded to it, any kind of things that are in CE that would be inclusive in what Richard's work group is doing as far as success or appropriated funds for more of those? Do you sense that yet, or are you still working on that?
I think the majority, if not all of the task force feels that there should be some success points. So I would expect that to have an impact on Richard's work.
Perfect. The reason I ask that is often, as I mentioned earlier in several meetings, the work of work group 1 tends to is very, very connected to other groups. And so I'm excited to say that if we get some of the work and input from Dr. Maldonado, Dr. Rodriguez into Mr. Cervantes' work, that would be very healthy for us all to be able then to look at toward this next meeting. Any questions for Cesar today? Any questions? Perfect. So before we kind of move into our next agenda item, which is about some subsequent meetings and some things I wanted to, is there any other thoughts about any of the work groups that we need to capture real quickly for, again, any data requests? Thank you so much to Marie, who's been just very, very diligent to get us, everyone, and Emily back data when they need it. There was a lot to look around the CE piece. There's a lot to look at with some of our core numbers, et cetera. So thank you so much again to coordinating board staff for always being right there with our information we need. We sure appreciate that. We're in our coming on November. It's hard to believe. And our next meeting is scheduled for November 17, 2021 at 2:00. I want to make a couple of encouragements. We're still trying to achieve our work as best we can by end of calendar year, but we do have January if we had to. But more importantly, if you find before now, in the week before or a few days before the November 17th meeting, that you're going to have some formally written recommendations to come to the committee, if you would pass those to Marie, so that we can distribute those alongside the materials, even though they're tentative. If you're like me, I sometimes like to read a recommendation, let it absorb before we come back in this format to try to talk about it and or vote on it, et cetera. So If you do those, feel free to send drafts of those items, of those recommendations to her to include. They will be drafts, of course, because we will vote those in and out of committee as need be. But I think that would be very helpful to all of us. And then we can read those ahead of time if we have a few days to do that. Our meeting 5 is already scheduled for December 8th, same time, 2:00 p.m. And then January, we do have a tentative January 5th if we need that. Vice Chair Garcia, do you have a question? Sir?
Yes, Dr. Wallace, sure, and just reflecting on what was said and factoring in the timeline of activities, I think I'm hearing is that the charge 4 and charge 5 is going to influence possibly some changes to Mr. Richards' body of work. With that said, it almost seems like come November, it would appear, again, if we want to be sensitive to this December closure, that it would seem like the November would be the ideal time to start having some closure on some of these items, especially if it's going to influence what Mr. Cervantes is doing. Food for thought.
No, and I agree totally. Well presented. We do need to, or at least enough information that placeholders can be placed in work group 1's items in case there is a shift. So it would behoove us to try to get some things on paper, begin to do something, and we can take them in multiple ways. I would prefer to have just ease for the staff at the coordinating board. It's preferable to have all of one particular charge voted on at once rather than piecemeals of it. It just gets kind of complicated if you say, well, we're not sure about this little nuance, but we want to go ahead and vote on this. It would behoove us to be able to just say, okay, charge 3, charge 2, charge whatever is, here's the recommendation, we review, we go about that. Please reach out to both myself and Raul and Marie maybe in the next 2 or 3 weeks as you begin to say, okay, we're coming close or we're not going to be close. And maybe that will also help us drive the agenda for November, because I do usually, as I've said, the work groups, all except one, seem to get have in the past gotten our work done November, and then tried to be where December meeting was finalizing that and finalizing work group, in this case, charge 1. But then that's also meant sometimes where we had to meet in January because we felt like we still had a few pieces left. We met in December, finished, and then moved to that next January for the final approval. But yes, I thank you, Raw, for that. And Dr. Rodriguez, we realize you have to go to another meeting. Not a problem, sir. We're about to close. So we'll send some things out. We appreciate your work. It's a lot of work, and you already have a lot of work to do. So this we do appreciate that. Again, thank you to the coordinating board. If there are no further questions or point of discussion, then for today, I would hear a motion to adjourn.
So move, Richard Cervantes.
Okay, Richard, and do I have a second? Second from Cesar, he waved his hand. All those in favor would signify by saying aye. And if you didn't want to adjourn, you can let us know that. The Community and Technical Colleges Formula Advisory Committee then is adjourned until November 17th, 2021 at 2 p.m. Thank you all for your service and your time.
Thank you. Have a great day.